Let's get started. Uh, Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, uh, and welcome to the webinar of Asian Leadership Conference hosted by the Chosun Daily. My name is Jason Lee. I'm a professor and John Monet Chair at Korea University, and I'm very happy to moderate today's webinar. Today, we will discuss the issue of democracy after the coronavirus. The COVID-19, the coronavirus, was an unexpected event. And over half a year, we have witnessed a number of unprecedented events, social distancing, quarantine, and virtually most of countries in the world are in a fear. And our lifestyle has been changed and challenged. And most of all, we are concerning how our society, how our democratic system will go through this coronavirus and how this coronavirus will change our society eventually. Okay, so uh, still coronavirus is an ongoing situation. We honestly do not know when it will end and where we are going. It's like we are drifting on an uncharted sea. So we need a navigation. We need a navigation, and for that, we do need an insight of knowledgeable person who will share the knowledge and insight. Okay, today we are very happy to host uh, a former Prime Minister Kjell Magne Bondevik, a former Prime Minister of Norway, and also the founding president of the Oslo Center for uh, for Freedom and for Peace and Human Rights. So once again, well, Prime Minister Bondevik, thank you very much for being with us. Good morning.
Morning. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me for this important event.
Yeah. So, well, it should be an early morning time in Norway this time, but
Yes.
the Korean audience and also actually the global audience have been waiting for your remark and somehow, well, as a mature politician, but and also as one of the leading intellectual and also as a priest, somehow we want to listen to your comments to navigate this unexpected the stormy sea. So first of all, the COVID-19 hit not just the China and East Asia, but it also many European countries were hit hardly by the COVID-19. And what was the situation in Norway and is the situation calming down or the Norwegian going back to their ordinary life and visiting the summer cottage?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Well, we were affected as almost all countries globally and on the European continent. And I think that is a consequence, of course, that we are living in a global community. We are traveling across the borders. We cannot isolate each other. We are interconnected. And of course, the corona is primarily consequence of that. A virus doesn't know any national border. And when we really realized in Norway that this may be a serious situation also in our country up in the high north was in the middle of March. 12th of March, our current prime minister, who was also a minister in my last cabinet, she announced very strong restrictions, closing down kindergartens, schools, restaurants, other places where people are meeting daily, and introduced regulations that we have to keep a distance of 2 meters between all of us, and we were not allowed to visit our cottages, our summer houses, because we shouldn't be a burden for the healthcare system in other communities that where we are living daily. So that was a very tough intervention by the government, and this had immediately also, of course, economic consequences for business companies, for restaurants, for all businesses in our country, and especially tourism was very hard affected. But after 20th of April, we were allowed to go to our cottages, our summer houses. So my wife and I, we went here where I'm now, and we have been living here since that time. So we are excluded more or less from the normal life in our local community, where most things are still closed down. But I will say that the situation in Norway is improving. It's handled, in my view, very well from our government, and we have 260, around 260 people who have died because of corona, but that is a rather small number compared to most other countries, also a neighboring country like Sweden.
Yeah, hope the situation will come down to a much more stable level, both in Korea and in Norway. So actually, well, it was pretty shocking for many Koreans and many observers outside that the European countries were quite advanced in dealing with this kind of the pandemic and other healthcare issues. But actually, the numbers of outbreaking the cases and also the death toll were much higher. So, well, some country actually took a much more kind of open stance and the collective the immune the strategy such as in Sweden and some other countries opt for the much more stricter the quarantine. And so how do you briefly how do you compare the responses of the Nordic and Northern countries, for example?
Yeah, you mean the Nordic countries
Yeah, well,
compared to
like
other countries?
Norway, Sweden, neighboring countries, of course.
Yeah. The Nordic countries try to coordinate the measures, and that is of obvious reasons. We are living close to each other, we are traveling across the borders without restrictions, and so on. But Sweden made some decisions that was a little bit different to the other Nordic countries. They didn't close down all these institutions that I mentioned that we did in Norway, and they did the same in Denmark, in Finland. So that has also made different outcomes and results. For instance, as I said, in Norway we have only around 260 people who died because of corona. In Sweden, the number is now up to 6,000. And of course, they have the double population of Norway, but despite of that, it's much higher number. So there may be different reasons behind this, of course, but I think it also has to do with how strong restrictions they implemented compared to Norway. So this has led to a rather much discussions in Sweden about their policy compared to Norway and the other Nordic countries, and that discussion is still going on. I think it was a main thinking in Sweden among the health authorities that they should create what we call immunity against this virus. But as far as I know, that immunity is limited and has given limited results. I'm satisfied with the way that the Norwegian government deal with this issue, despite it has huge economic consequences for Norway. But of course, Norway is in a lucky situation. We have all these incomes from oil and gas,
Mm-hmm.
and we have this petroleum fund
Mm-hmm.
that we could draw upon also in this situation. So government and parliament, they have made many what we can call economic packages to
Mm-hmm.
stimulate
Mm-hmm.
our business life and industry in this difficult situation. And that has also limited the bad consequences
Uh-huh.
of the corona situation.
Yeah, actually, the energy governance in Norway have been praised for the kind of the exemplary one in the world. The COVID-19, actually, the coronavirus, well, hit virtually every citizen in the country, the young generation and also the old generation. But I'm curious. Well, I'm especially curious about the impact on the younger generation because they cannot go to schools and of course no party, no gatherings, and many of them might have been pretty upset and somewhat depressed, and sometimes, well, they became angry because they have the energy, but they have dynamics, but they were supposed to be constrained in their the residents were very limited the circles of activity. So how the so what how to what is the best way to take care of the minds, the mentals and minds of this younger generation? Oftentimes, well, they got either isolated or they express their anger in an extreme way.
I will say that in general, this was handled in a very good way in Norway. Uh, it is, of course, it was a potential threat that young people could be angry and express how angry they
Mhm.
are. But I will say that this has went very well in Norway.
Mhm.
I think one main reason for that was that the government and our health authorities were very clever in explaining the situation with COVID-19 in the media. They had daily press conferences. They explained how serious this situation is. They explained in a very good way why they made all these restrictions and why it was necessary, and it was to protect all people and also the young people's health and their future. And I will also say that the parents around in the families in general were very clever to explain to their children why we have to do these things. And another good thing in Norway was that our education system and our schools were very clever to make what we can call the conditions for home education
Mhm.
by social media, by web. They introduced education programs for the pupils. They were online with the pupils in their classes. The teachers were online with their pupils. And I know that most families try to organize like a school day at home. They started at the same time as they should go to school. They had educations with the teachers on the computers. They had a break for lunch. They came back to the computers and had more education till the day, and it as it does in school. And of course, this is not the same as to meet in the classrooms, but it was a good substitute And I think that was a key for keeping all the young people in Norway calm down, and they succeeded with that. So, of course, as long as the time was going on, it was some frustrations. Many of the pupils wanted to go back to school. I know this because I have 10 grandchildren, and all of them are in school. So they wanted to go back. They wanted to meet their friends. That's natural. But I will say this was handled generally in a very good way. And after some weeks, they also gradually opened the schools.
Mhm.
First for the youngest pupils, and so for the older ones, and it went well. So all the pupils and students in Norway could meet physically before the summer vacation. And I think that was also a key. They saw their friends
Mhm.
before they
Before
went for
summer,
vacation.
yeah, before the summer break. Okay, well, that was well. Also in Korea, we have witnessed a very rapid transformation and transition to digital and online based education. So,
Mm.
well, all of a sudden we didn't just knock the door, but we just opened the door for the next platform of education. But this time,
If I can add one thing, if I can add one thing, where we have still going on a discussion, which
mhm,
also affect the young people very much, that is with regard to sport, and
uh,
especially football, soccer, which is so
mhm,
popular in Norway.
mhm,
Because for some weeks, all sport arrangements were closed down, of course. Um, we couldn't have matches, they couldn't have training,
mhm,
and so many thousands of young people in Norway, both girls and boys, are engaged. And this affects the daily life, of course, of that for them and for their families. And but it's gradually open. So now we have football matches on top level,
uh,
uh, and gradually they try to open it also for younger people, but still there are some restrictions on some lower levels. It's not allowed to have football matches and to meet again, and you have the same in other sports, and this has created some anger
uh-huh,
because they say when people are meeting in schools and they are meeting in other frameworks, why couldn't they meet on a sport arena and to have training and to have matches and so on? But here the Norwegian government has been rather restrictive.
mhm.
They have tried to explain why it's necessary, but it has created much engagement, I will say, but maybe not anger, but engagement and discussions.
I see. Okay, so I may follow up a little bit more of uh, a little bit more darker side of this coronavirus because uh, some people remain untapped in a sense. Well, they were safe at home and they could work via online, but some people actually couldn't do that, and they had to be on site, and they had to some take more risk and on the one hand, and on the other hand, well, the hatred and somehow more kind of the antithesis have been growing in the society, especially toward the weaker groups and most notably anti-foreigner and well, in Europe, the anti-Asian sentiment have been growing. In the United States, also the some small to medium level riots and well well began to emerge. So the COVID-19 also brought ignited some kind of the weaker links of society and solidarity. So how do you see especially this anti-foreigner and anti-Asian Chinese sentiment in Europe?
Well, there are some differences between European countries, of course, and I see in the news, in the media, that it has been uh, problems in that regard that you describe now. and that the corona situation has fueled hatred and extremism. But I will say that in Norway and in the Nordic countries in general, that I know best, this has not been a serious problem. Of course, we, as other countries, we have some extreme groups, but I will say rather small ones. And I don't think that the corona situation has made a difference in this regard. We are a small country. We have small differences between people. We have a good social welfare system, a network of social um, means that can help people in a difficult situation. And this welfare system has been very helpful, of course, now in this corona situation when people had to leave the jobs. They got economic support, and also the companies themselves got economic support. The parliament and the government of Norway made some economic packages, as I mentioned, that were very, very helpful in this critical situation. So I will say that more or less it has been a calm situation in Norway. I haven't really acknowledged serious problems with hatred and extremism in this situation. But of course, I follow the news and see that it's different in several other countries, in some European countries and on other continents as well. But here up in the north, this has not been a real problem so far.
I see. So yes, still Norway and the Nordic countries would be actually more peaceful than in some other parts in Europe and some other parts of the world. But well, at a pan-European levels and also at the global levels, and many peoples in Asia, for example, we are
Yeah, I
worried
think so, and
better
I
about
think
this kind of
I think
hatred.
this has to do this. I think this has to do also what we often call the Nordic model. It's a welfare system with very small differences between people. People are engaged in the civil society as well. And that is a part of our democracy and as a part of our welfare system. Many people are engaged in non-governmental organization, humanitarian, social, Christian organizations, and so on. And this gives us a platform for being engaged, for being included. And that is a key word that I will come back to. It's not only a question about formal democracy, it's a question about inclusive democracy, where people are feeling included. Of course, we also may have some problems in this regard. We are not perfect, uh, but absolutely not. But I will say, compared to most other countries, we are in a lucky situation.
Hmm. Yeah, but if we broaden the horizon, then the COVID-19 actually brought sometimes a pretty serious crisis of democracy. And well, the quarantine and the public health care system, and also a number of economic stimulus package requires the strong state and more government engagement. So whereas some advanced democracies been handling that those kind of issues in a much more matured way, but in a number of countries, for example, in Eastern Europe and some other countries, well, it even intensified the existing the authoritarian the government and also the separation of power. So the kind of judiciary branch and legislative branch often being subordinated, at least temporary, in the name of emergency, the, to the government power. So how do you, from a much more broader perspective, how you have witnessed it and how you have observed this crisis of democracy in some other European countries?
This is a very interesting question, and it may have consequences for the future. of our countries all over the world, how we handle this crisis now. Of course, I think in a way Norway also here is in a lucky situation because we have a multi-party political system. We are used to cooperate across political borders. We have very often, and that was also the case when I was prime minister twice, we have minority governments. And that means that the government depends on support from other parties in parliament. So we are very used to work closely together between government and parliament and between the political parties. And that was, in a way, an advantage in this situation. Some will say that this was a disadvantage because you needed a majority government that could handle the situation very powerful and efficiently. But in the longer perspective, I think it was good that the government depended on parties in parliament. So it was a very close cooperation over several weeks when the government worked out some proposals, economic packages, social packages, and they had to go down to parliament and to present them and to discuss with the parties there. And they worked very efficiently, day and night, and in all cases, they achieved a broad consensus across the political parties on solutions. And they presented this. It was approved in the plenary. And I think this has avoided the threat that COVID-19 should create more authoritarianism and non-democratic measures. But of course, because of the very special situation, this crisis, the parliament approved a law that gave the government more executive power and even legislative power than in a normal situation. So it strengthened the government, but that was necessary in a situation of crisis where you have to react. You cannot wait for normal political procedures where you present the law to the parliament and it has to go out on hearing in civil society, and it takes months and years to get it approved in parliament. That was, of course, impossible in this situation. So it was made an emergency law. It was approved by the parliament. The government got more power than normally. But that law had a limited time limit. So after, I think it was 2 months or something like that, that law was removed. And now we are back to a normal political situation in that regard. So I think, at least in Norway, we had a test on our democratic system, but I think we made it. And now we are back to a normal democratic political solution. But as you touched upon, Mr. Moderator, it is a danger for the future now, I think, in some countries, that more authoritarian leaders has used or misused this situation where they have to have strong power to limit the democratic system and to reduce democracy. So I think, and this is a very interesting discussion, how can we avoid such a development? We see tendencies in some countries that are also in principle democratic, and where we now see more authoritarian ruling of the country. And I'm afraid that some leaders will not go back to the more normal democratic system. And we have to have a discussion in the international organizations how we can avoid this development. I have already participated in some web seminars where this is the topic for the discussion. And of course, this is also a danger in some developing countries at all continents, in Africa, in Asia, and where the normal democratic political systems are not functioning for the time being.
Yeah.
And the question is, will they go back to a more normal situation? There is a responsibility for international leaders to take up this discussion, and we have seen some setbacks for democracy over the last years, and now especially under the corona situation, which is a real concern to many of us.
Yes, in your point of the more corporative governance, more kind of multi-level and multi-stakeholder the approach to cope with COVID-19 could be even more powerful in the end than one party dominating the system, and it may give more resilience to democratic governance. And also your point on the future the future discussion among the international leaders and international governance to take care of this kind of the democratic governance in many countries. So, but so what I'm feeling is eventually what matters is the resilience of governance, resilience of democracy, and the strengths and fundamental strengths of democracy in the society. And if we can say the fundamentals of democracies is important, then what kind of specific values and principle of democracy we should hold in times of this coronavirus crisis?
Yeah, of course, we don't have a specific international definition of democracy, but we have some main criteria. It is a division of power between the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive power, and that is a core value of democracy that we have to take care of course. But as I also mentioned, democracy is not only some formal criteria, it is a question of a democratic culture, and therefore, of course, more new democracies that don't have the same background and traditions and culture as many of us have, they are more vulnerable for the consequences of such a crisis that we now face. But I will say, as I mentioned earlier, for me, it is a key word that we have to focus on now, and that is what I will call inclusive democracy. Inclusive democracy means not only these formal democratic institutions with political parties, with parliament, with governments, with the power sharing, but it is a question of protecting the minorities. The minorities. That not some groups are lagging behind with regard to rights, to human rights, and to taking part in the political life. Democracy is not that the winner takes it all. Democracy is how we treat the minorities also. And this corona situation will be a real test on that. And this has to do with political minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and so on. How do we keep all these groups included in the future welfare and democratic system? That is, in my view, the main challenge. And therefore, it's not only a question about the political institutions, how we share the power between the executive and the legislative body. It's a question about the civil society. How do we keep up all engagement in the civil society through non-governmental organizations and through other activities? That will be, in my view, the main test for the future after Corona.
Okay, so the being inclusive, you mean may need what I can understand is may require kind of both two directional approach. One is more kind of top down approach. The government should be more inclusive in the addressing the minority issues and those the protecting the weaker parties. But at the same time, you are also highlighting that the more active kind of civil engagement and more bottom up the grassroots engagement to build this kind of the new culture, new and new democracy. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I think you describe it in a good way. And if you look around the world today, we have several countries now with a formal democracy,
Mm-hmm.
but because they don't have this inclusive democracy, I say, where people are engaged in the civil society, they are much more vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
to be taken over by authoritarian powers and leaders. Because people are not engaged. They have the right to go to vote every fourth year, but that is not the same as a real inclusive democracy. So to create a culture that can stand against a development towards more authoritarianism, that is, in my view, the main challenge, and has to be on top of the political agenda after Corona, which must be discussed all over the world, I think.
So, it's just very important point. So, could you clarify just a little bit, how we can classify the minority and the weaker groups? What kind of the people you have in mind? The kind of less fortunate, the people, or women and children, or foreign, the immigrants, etc.
Yes, you pointed to some of the groups that I'm thinking of. But I think also of religious minorities, because we,
Uh-huh.
for instance, know that the religion is a conflict dimension in several countries. I'm talking about ethnic minorities, because we know that ethnicity is a real conflict dimension in many countries. It
Mm-hmm.
has to do, of course, as you mentioned, with immigrants, with a different background, different culture from the majority, and that is really creating tensions and conflicts in many countries, and to some extent also in Norway and in Nordic countries. This is still a big challenge. So there are different minority groups, and we have to lift them up. This has also a social economic dimension, of course, because you have some groups that are lagging behind economically and socially, and can maybe handicapped people,
Mm-hmm.
immigrants, and others who don't have the same economic conditions as the majority. So this is a huge challenge. All should feel included, and that they have something to say in the society.
Okay, so the solidarity, but kind of building new kind of solidarity would be the key challenge.
Yes,
Yeah.
you can also call it solidarity. That's right. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah. And in the meantime, actually, during past few months, we also faced a dilemma between the efficacy of quarantine and the personal privacy, and that is also an issue of the issue of fundamental democracy, the freedom and individual right and privacy. Oftentimes, for the more efficient tracing of coronavirus, sometimes government needed some more personal information and cell phone the record, and for some people, it was accepted as the as totally possible, the tracing. And for some people, that was quite the fundamental challenge, violation of personal privacy. So more and more we are relying on digital platform to deal with this coronavirus. So what do you think about this dilemma between the efficacy and individual privacy?
Yeah, that's another very interesting and important discussion. I think the question that we just discussed now about the future of democracy is one main issue that we have to evaluate. Another one is what you point to now, the dilemma and the judgment between public safety and personal privacy. Um, so I will say this is one of the issues that we have to evaluate now after COVID-19. The modern society with all these social platforms, with the modern technology, um, is of course, they have many advantages. It has made the communication much more efficient, and we can sit like this, for instance, now having a web seminar that was not possible some years ago. But on the other hand, it is of course also a potential threat to privacy and and to the right of freedom. Uh, and we had some discussions also in Norway about this, and how we should protect our private life. In when the authorities wanted much more, as much information as possible about the health situation among common people, and will this threat our privacy? Um, I don't, of course, nobody has a clear answer to this dilemma today, but we have to discuss it, and we have to try to find rules and mechanisms that on the one hand takes care of the public safety in situations with pandemic, for instance, and other international crises. Terrorism and is another relevant issue, and on the other hand, the personal privacy. So this has to do with human dignity, protection of human dignity, protection of human rights. We cannot take in use all modern mechanisms in order to deal with the crisis. We have to be careful because it can be misused by individuals and by authorities to threaten our privacy and human dignity.
So did you see any some possible cases of violating that the fundamental kind of the dignity and well, especially at the privacy level, while dealing with COVID-19, not just in Norway, but at a much more global scale?
Yes, of course, there are potential huge consequences, and that is, for instance, if authorities collect information about you as a person on issues that are really private, and they need this information in a situation of crisis to deal with it, to protect us against, for instance, a virus, a pandemic. But if this information is kept for a long time, it can be used or misused for other purposes. So here we need a very clear legislation, more clear than today, with clear limitations for how long time they can keep such information. And we know that this can also open channels for other people who are not responsible, that they go into and find such information. They can intervene our social platforms, all these equipments that we use today by modern technology. This is of course not only a threat in a crisis situation, it's also a threat in a more normal situation. So I don't think we have the answers yet. We don't know about the future. The only thing we know is that this will develop faster and faster, and that we need to take measures.
Well, you have mentioned the human dignity issues and also the minority the issues, but it's somewhat related agenda. But oftentimes the gender equality and the gender protection issue have been quite prevailing in many countries, and well, unfortunately, a number of kind of the sexual harassment, the especially even at the higher ranking kind of the officers and the higher ranking the CEOs and more famous the celebrities, and that is happening in virtually in many countries in Asian countries in the US. So how do you, well, from the perspective of human dignity and the minority protection, how to the how to deal with this kind of the protecting the gender right and the gender safe, well, kind of the gender safety issue, well, if we can possibly call the in the workplace and also in many other organizations somehow in Korea and also in many Asian countries, we are facing these issues much more directly. Well, the Nordic countries have been, well, have longer history in dealing in achieving this kind of the gender equality. But well, whether we expect or not, from time to time, some scandals are emerging and sometimes eyebrows and sometimes well, it really becomes a serious kind of social issue. So what's your comment on yeah on this gender equality?
Yeah, gender equality is of course a main challenge still in many countries. It has improved, no doubt, and I will say that in Norway and the Nordic countries, I think we are in a rather good situation on most areas with regard to gender equality and also avoiding the problems with gender harassment and, for instance, sexual harassment as a serious part of that. But we know that the situation is not that good in all countries. I'm traveling much internationally, and this is always an issue I raise. And it's not, as I also said with regard to democracy, it's not only a question of formal regulations. It's also a question about culture and traditions. How do you treat both sexes in an equal way? And of course, a pandemic as COVID-19 may create setbacks also in this regard. So this is a situation that we have to deal with. We have to evaluate the consequences after Corona-19 in this framework. In my view, it has to do both with the legislation on the one hand, that has to be very strong with regard to gender equality, but it also has to do with the culture in the country. In Norway, I think we have created through the years that I have been engaged in politics, created a culture of equality, and it has been real progress over the last 40, 50 years when I have been politically engaged, not because of me, of course, and the women especially. So now we have equal representation in all political bodies in Norway. It's no discussion any longer. You have to have at least 40% of both sexes in all political bodies. I remember when I presented my governments, it was no discussion. I couldn't come there with the government of 70% men, for instance. That would be then politically impossible. And we are focusing on all violations and harassments of women, for instance. So I think we have avoided that now. But I know from personal experience when traveling around in the world that this is not the situation all over. I'm afraid that Corona has made some setbacks also in this regard. So I have no other answer that we have to take up again our responsibility to fight against these differences that are still there. And as I said, it has both to do with the legislation and it has to do with the culture. And creating the culture framework for equality takes much more time than to adopt a new law, of course. So it's a long way to go,
Mhm.
but it's necessary to walk.
Yeah, certainly it is a matter of law, and it is a matter of ethics and morality, and also it is about the perception of gender equality. So,
Yeah.
well, as you have mentioned, the both stronger and stricter legislation and the cultural kind of the changing the way of thinking would be more fundamental way to deal with that gender equality and gender protection. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
if I may
sure.
add just to this point that there are also a responsibility for other leaders than political leaders. For instance, religious leaders
Uh-huh.
and leaders of non-governmental organization, because they are so important. They reach out
Hmm.
many people in their countries, and they have a responsibility to both talk about and to practice gender equality. And that has been interesting for me. I have participated at several interreligious dialogue, for instance, with
Mm.
representatives from all the main religions and talk with the leaders there. And when we come to this question about gender equality, it, very often there are some differences, and it has been very interesting to discuss it and to try to encourage them to feel the responsibility for treating men and women equally.
Uh-huh. Yes, well, certainly, yes, we also have to live in live in a spiritual world too. So I think, the role of religious leader, yes, I do agree. Well, that would be the great help. Well, that would contribute a lot to building a new culture. Okay, so uh, we are also curious about your Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights. You're the founder and the president. So, and we heard that your center had many activities the in enhancing peace and human rights. So could you tell us briefly about your center?
Yes, as you already mentioned, it was founded by myself and a colleague of mine back in 2006 after I stepped down as prime minister. I wanted to use my background, my experience, my international network to do something positive for people in need um, in the world. And when we started 14 years ago, we took up different projects that came in our way to have a portfolio. We made some human rights activities and projects. One of them I will come back to, namely, we contributed to human rights report with
Mhm.
regard to North Korea.
Uh-huh.
We had also some interreligious dialogue projects, and
Mhm.
the biggest one, and maybe the most interesting, was with the former president of Iran, Mohammad Khatami, who is a
Mhm.
reformist, a dialogue-oriented man, rather different to the current regime. And I met him when we both were in position, and so we took up the cooperation after we stepped down. And it was a very interesting dialogue project about Islam and the West. And I met in Tehran and in Oslo and so on. But more and more over the last years, we have focused on what we call democracy assistance projects. And that means that by request from authorities in several countries where democracy is developing but vulnerable and fragile, um, we try to share our experience on how to run, especially democratic political institutions. And that means, of course, parliaments, governments, and political parties. This triangle of institution must function in a real democracy. But we also, um, in line with what I said previously, we also work with the civil society and especially young people,
Mhm.
bring together youth across ethnic, cultural, religious borders to calm down tensions and to unite them in demands to the authorities. And we do the same with regard to women and to encourage more women to go into political life.
Mhm.
So that is now our main program field. And for the time being, we have projects in Kenya, and we are on the way to go into Tanzania and hopefully also Uganda. We have been in countries like Somalia, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, the Kyrgyz Republic, and Ukraine in Europe. We are a small country compared to many others. Norway is a small country compared to others, but we have cooperation and agreements with bigger democracy assistance organizations internationally. So I think we can represent an added value. So that is primarily what we are doing. We have a small headquarter here in Oslo, Norway, and we have a local office in Kenya, and we will also establish one in Dar es in Tanzania, because we start projects there, and I feel it very meaningful for me personally also to contribute in that way and to draw upon my own background.
Yeah, and actually the Oslo Center used to work on the North Korean human rights agenda too. At this moment, actually, we do not have a clear picture on still on North Korean situation, but we can reasonably guess that the human rights condition in North Korea still face a number of crises, the number of challenges, and it might have been worsened even under the COVID-19 and also the continued sanction situation. So how do you assess the current situation of North Korean human rights issues, and what would you suggest to make progress on North Korean human rights issues?
Yeah. First, just very briefly say that it's no doubt that the human rights situation in North Korea is very, very serious. It's both with regard to political, civil rights, but also social and economic rights, and that we documented this in our report, which was primarily made by DLA Piper, a U.S. law firm. I think the main issue is to try to bring North Korea out of the isolation. I learned personally former President Kim Dae-jung to know very well, and I learned to know about his sunshine policy. And his main idea was to bring North Korea out of isolation, to make common projects with them. We know he made this industry park project, railway project across the border, and tourism and so on, and especially, of course, this family unification events, and I attended one of them, and that made a very big impression on me. That was back in the year 2000. So we know that the US president has tried to have some meetings with the North Korean leader. That's fine, but it has not been followed up. And I think maybe we should think about the six-party framework again, with these six countries that try to engage North Korea in a dialogue, because we cannot only condemn the human rights situation in North Korea. We have to bring them out of the isolation into the international community. My experience, our experience, is that is the only way. We saw that with the communist countries, and when the communist system collapsed. We have to bring North Korea in on the international scene, arena, to have a dialogue with them. I think that is the only lasting solution.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, we do need the global and international collaboration to bring North Korea out of isolation, and also have to address the human rights issues. But the interesting thing is, while the denuclearization, the issues began to receive more highlight as usual, and while the North Korea U.S. dialogue and a series of dialogue went on, but in the meantime, sometimes it left an impression that human rights issue all of a sudden became something like a taboo that became an obstacle in enhancing the cooperation, the economic agenda, and more importantly, denuclearization agenda. So somehow it has been sidelined the human rights issues have been sidelined and remain untouched in a number of bilateral discussion. Well, of course, I do expect the series of discussion will be galvanized in the near future. But how to deal with this human rights issue? Is it okay to put aside the human rights issues? Well, and just focus on nuclear and other economic cooperation agenda, or uh, should we bring these human rights issues? This is a very sensitive one, so even well, it may even hamper the progress of other discussions. So, what is your advice? What is your assessment?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'm the right person living here up in the high north, far from Korea Peninsula, to have the right answer. But I think it has to do more. I do fully agree that we have to have human rights situation on the agenda, no doubt, because that is one of the serious problems with regard to the Korean Peninsula and north-south of Korea. But it has to do with how we approach it, I think. If they in the north feel that we are only condemning, and they feel that this is a threat to our nation, to our state, it will not work. But if they understand that we want the best for North Korea, we want the best for the people there, we want them as an international partner, we want to contribute to an economic development in the country, to more social welfare and so on, then it may be easier to raise also the human rights issues. Of course, they have huge challenges. They have so many political prisoners. They have not freedom of religion, really freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and these fundamental human rights. But I think the main issue is that they can feel safe, that they can feel that they will be included. And then it's not only a question about the US North Korea dialogue. I think more countries must be engaged, and maybe that will also create a better atmosphere for a real dialogue, despite I know that the North Korean leader is very keen on having also this direct dialogue with the US. Of course, South Korea is a main country here. You are affected by what happens in the north, and I am encouraged by also the current president's willingness to have a dialogue with the North Korean leader, and I hope that he will not give up.
Yeah, in the well, dealing with this kind of human rights issues may require a longer effort, and sometimes we are thinking also somehow United States or China or Korea maybe at some point may not be the best stakeholder to bring this issue on the front, but European countries, European Union, and the Nordic countries, traditionally it has been the kind of diplomatic tradition to focus on this kind of the value oriented and human right and peace building effort. So in that sense, well, can we as a Korean citizen, can we expect the more kind of the constructive engagement of the European partners and Nordic countries in enhancing this kind of North Korean human rights issues, and also your center?
Yeah, I think we all can contribute, and I think we are also have a political system in the Nordic countries, and we have core values that can be useful in this framework, and we are always to the disposal. But we know that you have some key nations that must be on board, and that is of course South Korea, it is US, it is China, it's Russia, it's Japan. These countries must create a framework for a further dialogue, and I hope that one day it will be possible to reunite the two Korean states. It is one nation, it is one people, and therefore, I also said that I will never forget when I attended one family unification event in Seoul back in the year 2000. I was invited by President Kim Dae-jung, and I saw family members meeting after 50 years, and the feelings that were created uh, was so strong and impressive. And I think that the human links are the strongest links. It's important with economic cooperation, with cultural cooperation, and all these things. But of course, the human links are the most important.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for your the warm advice. Well, the time is almost over, but the discussion was so interesting. So I somehow I somehow extended the session for a few more minutes. So we started from the COVID-19 and we discussed democracy and the future shape of democracy and then peace and human rights issues and also North Korean issues. And once again, we thank you very much for your the warm insight and warm the advice to Korea. And so, well, we are still on a stormy sea of coronavirus, but hope we can go through this crisis and we will be able to sail again on a much calmer sea. And then we can meet each other, not just via online, but offline meeting as usual and sharing more humane and personal data intimacy. So once again, we deeply appreciate for your time and your joining in this webinar. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Van der Ven.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me for this dialogue. It was a great pleasure to participate. And I think this COVID-19 situation has really shown us that we are depending on each other all over the world. It started in China, but it affects all countries. We are interdependent, interconnected. And in my view, a consequence of that is that we need a stronger international cooperation. That will also be a part of the discussion after Corona. Should we depend more on ourselves as states and countries, or should we strengthen the international cooperation? My answer is very clear. We have to strengthen our international cooperation, not weaken the international organizations that some want to do now with WHO and so on. And we have to exchange information, and maybe we have to change our lifestyle as well to some extent. For me, the core values that we have to protect during and after Corona is human dignity. It is about democracy. And I hope and I do look forward to visit Seoul again and
Sure.
to come and to meet face to face physically. That's I have so good experiences from visiting South Korea, and I hope it will be possible again as planned for now in November. So, but thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you very much. And
thank you.
See you again very soon.
I look forward to.
Take good care. Okay. Thank you.